Good evening and welcome to Kuhn Academy for this installment of AP Government. Building responsible voters one video at a time. Okay, we're going to talk to you today about the federal court structure, just some basics as to how this works. We covered this before at the Constitution test, but just want to highlight a couple more things. As we know in the Constitution, it doesn't say anything about the court structure besides the fact that there will be a Supreme Court and what are called inferior courts. Make sure you know that term, inferior courts. Those are created up to Congress to create. So Congress can decide how many courts there are, what jurisdiction they have, what areas they cover, and so on. Okay, so the main ones we know is the U.S. District Courts. Okay, we have 94 of them as of 2005. Not much has changed since then. So there's basically district courts around the country. Obviously, there's one in Chicago, Springfield, places like that. These are trial courts, okay, run by federal judges. Juries are present, and so on. Okay. Also, the military courts and tribunals, okay, which is set up by the military under Congress's power to raise and support an army. Okay. And we got hearings with panels of federal agencies, including independent agencies. These are our regulatory commissions, like the Securities Exchange Commission, FCC. They have their own courts that basically try their own cases. Outside of the traditional federal court structure, they're kind of within their own court system, or their own bureaucratic system, which is why they say they have quasi-judicial powers. Okay, the bankruptcy courts deal with bankruptcy laws, claims courts, tax courts, and so on. Okay, since Congress is in charge of the District of Columbia, they create courts to regulate D.C., which we know is just legalized marijuana, so I'm sure there'll be a case there rather soon. Okay, territorial courts. And then this big one, we'll talk about this in the next unit, they're called FISA courts, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And these were set up because Congress passed a law on foreign intelligence and that it cannot be gathered in the United States against citizens. So these courts are set up to grant warrants to the government to go and search and so on. So we'll talk about them a little more later. All right. Then we have the appeals courts, which Congress created in the late the 1920s. Basically as a way to handle appeals before they get to the Supreme Court. So we have our legislative appeals courts, those are your basics. Okay, and then the Court of Appeals for the Armed Services, again from the power to raise and support an army. Courts of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, right? So that's the one out of the bureaucracy. That's the D.C. Court of Appeals. That's the most significant one. Most judges appointed to that will end up going on to the Supreme Court just because they're kind of tested, if you will. They give their position on all federal issues and federal cases that come out of the bureaucratic agencies. So the justices kind of have a clean record. We know what they stand for. And then we have our courts of appeals, 12 of those plus the D.C. Circuit. And then there's anywhere between 6 and 28 judges on those, again determined by Congress. So a big issue last year with the recess appointments was President Obama wanted to and the Democrats wanted to put more people on the D.C. Court of Appeals, i.e. packing the courts, which is totally legal, and the Republicans kept blocking their nominations, arguing we didn't need those justices, the courts were not backlogged. This was just Obama trying to put more Democrats on there to break some ties. And then they hear cases from all the federal district courts, so we know the appeal structure. Okay, and then we're familiar with the Supreme Court. 9 justices determined by Congress. That can be changed, but it has to be by Congress, FDR. They have original jurisdiction, as we know in cases versus a state, or state versus citizens of another state, state against a foreign country, and so on. Most of their cases are heard on appeal. They come from the courts of appeals, state Supreme Courts, federal courts of appeals for the armed services, and then the appeals for the federal circuit, or cases that come out of the bureaucratic agencies. Most of those come under a writ of certiorari, which is a Latin term for basically bringing up the court records from a previous case. And they are usually denied by the justices. They usually take around 80 cases. There's about 1,500 appealed a year. Thousands were made annually, but less than 100 make the court. Those not granted are then sent back to the lower court, and then that decision stands. So that's what happened in a couple of the gay marriage cases earlier this year, is the court agreed not to hear the case from the lower court, basically allowing those rulings to stand. That's what got us up to 35 states that have allowed gay marriages. All right? And then finally, we also name the courts for the Chief Justice that presides over those. We are currently in the Roberts Court. That's been going on for about 10 years, so that's now, I guess, in the history books. The Marshall Court, was very national dominated. That's Marbury versus Madison, McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, all cases that strengthened the national government. Taney Court was the one that did Dred Scott decision, kind of infamous Civil War fame. Warren Court's your most significant from 53 to 69. This led to most of your civil rights changes. Brown versus Board of Education, Miranda versus Arizona, Mapp versus Ohio, some of the ones you might remember from criminal law, but a very liberal court, especially in criminal rights and civil rights, or rights of the accused, I should say. And then finally, the Rehnquist Court, which ended about 10 years ago, and that was extremely conservative, giving a lot of rights back to the states, like U.S. versus Lopez and others, but kind of liberal on things like free speech. And same with the Roberts Court, they've been very pro free speech as well. All right, so just a little overview of the federal court structure. We'll talk more in class tomorrow. Thanks for listening to the Kuhn Academy, where we're building responsible voters one video at a time. Have a wonderful day.